Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our Distinguished Visitor Lecture Series of the Lieberthal-Rogel China Center at the University of Michigan. I'm Mary Gallagher, I'm the director. We hope this is the first of what we hope to be several lectures over the next 12 months or so on the issue of U.S.-China relations in the context of the presidential election in the United States and the leadership transition that will begin in China next year. So I'm really happy to welcome you to the beginning of this series. The speaker today, Professor David Shambaugh, is a nationally and internationally recognized author and authority on contemporary China and international relations of Asia. An interesting statistic on David is that he has visited or lived in China every year since 1979 and has traveled extensively throughout Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Next semester, he will be a distinguished visiting professor at Nanyang Technical University in Singapore at their School of International Studies. He's also currently the professor of political science and international affairs and is the founding director of the China Policy Program in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, where he also received his bachelor's. From 96 to 2016, he was the non-resident senior fellow in Foreign Policy Studies program at the Brookings Institution. And prior to being at GW, Professor Shambaugh was a reader in Chinese politics at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, where he was also editor of the China Quarterly, which is the most renowned journal in China studies globally. He served on many boards, including the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the U.S. Asia-Pacific Councils, and many other scholarly and public policy organizations. He's also been selected for numerous awards and grants, including a Fulbright Scholar and a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. So get to his publishing record, which is, I have to say, very long and would probably go till 4:30 if I read everything. He has published more than 30 books. So I'm going to just talk about a couple of his most recent books. His most recent book is China's Future, which I highly recommend if you want to get a sense of what he thinks is in store for China. Looking at various different outcomes. The China Reader, Rising Power, which are both from 2016. 2013, he published a very well-known and well-awarded book, China Goes Global, The Partial Power, and that was selected by The Economist, Foreign Affairs, and Bloomberg News as one of the best books of the year. Other books include Tangled Titans, The United States and China from 2012, Charting China's Future, Domestic and International Challenges, 2011, and the list goes on and on. So I highly recommend you look at his website to see some of his less recent publications. We're also happy to say that David received his PhD from the University of Michigan in the Department of Political Science, so he is a Wolverine and has a long-standing relationship to Michigan because he has a summer home in the Traverse City area. I was going to say the UP, but you're actually not a Youper. So today, he will be speaking on From America's Presidential Election to China's 19th Party Congress, Where Do U.S.-China Relations Go From Here? Please join me in welcoming Professor David Shambaugh. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Thank you very much, Mary, for an overly generous but very kind introduction. I'm really very pleased to be back in Ann Arbor, and particularly at the university. It's the first time in 30 years that I've had the chance professionally to come back to the university, although I do pass through Ann Arbor every year on my way to and from Traverse City, as Mary just noted. And it's a real pleasure to be invited back by the Center for Chinese Studies, the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, as a distinguished visitor. There's no greater honor, really, for an alumni of any institution than to be invited back to their alma mater. So this really is personally very meaningful to me, and I'm just delighted to be here. When I was a student here, this building didn't exist. It was a parking lot, as I recall. So a few things have changed, but a lot has not. This certainly, though, I can tell you, is nothing that I expected when I was a student. One doesn't know where their life will go. I didn't in the 1980s, but it's great to be back. I have so many fond memories of my time here in the early and mid 1980s. And I had the very great fortune to be here during what I think is recognized as the golden era of Chinese studies at the U of M. I'm sure you're on track for a second golden era at present, but no doubt about it, in the 1970s and 1980s, this was the place to be in the world, not just the United States. It was the #1 Center for Chinese Studies globally, and it was a magnet for professors, for students, intellectuals interested in China. So I was also in the political science department where I got my doctorate, which was also near the top of the rankings then, still is, one of the best in the country and the world. And the combination of the two, Chinese studies and political science, was really unbeatable. Not to mention the history department as well, Institute for Social Research, and other elements of the university. And we students were all beneficiaries of this concentration of expertise in those years. And if you look around the United States today, actually, or around the world for that matter, other academic institutions, the graduates of those years now populate the departments of Chinese studies on a national and global basis, which is real testimony to its ranking and status at the time. Now, I'm going to ask you to indulge me for a minute or two at the outset before I get to the topic tonight with a few reminiscences of that era for those of you who were not here. And it would be remiss if I didn't note the names of those professors who were so influential in my own learning and professional development. My principal mentors were Michael Oxenberg and Alan Whiting, jointly. They were both dynamic classroom teachers, wise advisors, extraordinary public intellectuals. Mike, as you know, was taken from us way too early at the age of 61, but in his 61 years, there was nobody like him. He was a true force of life, a real one of a kind. His enthusiasm for everything was infectious, from China to Michigan football. I'm not sure which he was more interested in, frankly, but he spent more than one halftime at Michigan Stadium. He was a very close friend of Bo Schembechler's, and Schembechler would invite him into the locker room during halftime. And those of you who knew Mike and knew Schembechler, their personalities were not dissimilar, actually. They even looked a bit alike. So he was really a life force, as I say. Alan Whiting was a quieter, but by no means less influential individual. He is still with us, just celebrated his 90th birthday this year, living in Southern California near Laguna. Now, so I was the beneficiary of these two individuals. It was by no means, I have to say, smooth sailing. You don't work under people of that renown and have smooth sailing. They were both real taskmasters. It was not always easy here. But I couldn't have asked for better mentors and role models. Ina, where's Ina? Ina will remember well. She was Mike Oxenberg's assistant in those years, how we graduate students would come in to see him and sit in the outer office, trembling, rather blue. And then we'd be ushered in to the inner sanctum of then Corner House, talk to the Emperor, Emperor Oxenberg, for 30 minutes or whatever, and then emerge kind of pale and and traumatized. You remember that? Ina had to witness all these young people going in and out. So it wasn't easy, but I really can't ask for more than them as mentors. I should also mention Ken Lieberthal, after whom the center is now co-named, who was also my professor and served on my PhD dissertation committee after Alan Whiting departed in 1985. Ken replaced him, and I was fortunate enough to have Ken also in the classroom as a teacher in 1980. He commuted back and forth at that time from Swarthmore to Ann Arbor. And we interact regularly in Washington, where he now lives, as you know. So I'm also grateful to Ken for the important role that he's played then and to this day in my career. Lastly, I don't want to take too much more time reminiscing about these personalities in that time, but I had the good fortune to take courses from real luminaries in the China field at that time. Robert Dernberger, Martin King White, Al Feuerwerker, Don Monroe. Is Don here today by any chance? No. Harriet Mills just passed away. And I came to know Norma Diamond, Itza Feuerwerker, Ken DeWaskin, Richard Edwards, who was my wife's supervisor, and Ernie Young. Is Ernie here today? Ernie! Great. Tom Buey asked me to give you a hug afterwards. So, it was really a world-class constellation of China expertise. And similarly in political science, I studied under Bill Zimmerman, Al Meyer, Sam Eldersveld, John Kingdon, Larry Moore, and others. So these were really great years. They were also glory years for Michigan football, I must say, under Coach Shambaugh and quarterback named Harbaugh. So the good times have returned to Michigan football again, despite last Saturday's agonizing loss that we're all still recovering from. Okay, apologies for beginning my lecture with indulgences of the past. Let me get on to the topic of the evening. So we've just had one major event in American politics with the November election, and by this time next year, we will have witnessed another major event in Chinese politics, the 19th Party Congress, which is scheduled for the fall, sometime in October or November. And these two major events serve as kind of bookends, I think, and an interesting prism through which to view the relationship. And I guess as the theme of the Center for Chinese Studies over the next year or so. So when Professor Gallagher invited me to come, she asked if I could speak to this theme, so I'm going to try. This is not a lecture I've given before. These events have just taken place, and the other one has not yet taken place, so what you're going to hear tonight is necessarily kind of speculative. But I'm going to discuss each side of the relationship. First, the American side, the state of the U.S.-China relationship and the China policy that President-elect Trump and his administration inherit, and what we can intuit from their dispositions about U.S. policy towards China. Second, I'll discuss the internal situation in China and the run-up to the Party Congress next year, as well as China's general policies towards the United States. And then finally, I'll attempt to put these two perspectives together and peer into the proverbial crystal ball and try and identify some possibilities as to how the relationship may evolve over the next few years. So let's begin with the state of the relationship and the China policy that President-elect Trump will inherit. Now, of course, no administration must continue the policy of the predecessor, although continuity is generally a good thing, at least it's reassuring to markets, but they're not bound to continue what President Obama has been doing for the last 8 years, which I'll tell you about in a second. But what I would say is that the Obama-China policy of the last 8 years reflected very strong continuity with the 8 years of the George Bush 43 generation. So we've had, in fact, 16 years of real consistent American China policy, built around two key features, the first of which I'd call hedged engagement, which means the strategic and security hedging against disruptive behavior or potentially disruptive behavior by the Chinese in Asia and elsewhere, combined with engagement on a range of bilateral and global governance issues. So if you look back at the Bush administration and you look over the last 8 years of the Obama administration, those two anchors, they didn't always use the same language, but they were those twin elements were the anchors of China policy. So that's an important inheritance. You know, the first thing I would advise the new Trump administration is to sit down and reflect on that the last 16 years, what's worked, what hasn't worked. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and start afresh. At least we hope they don't. With regard to the Bush China policy, you will probably recall Robert Zoellick's famous speech in 2005, calling on China to become a so-called responsible international stakeholder by which he was critical of China's lack of contributions to international global governance. He basically argued that China's now a global power, second leading power. They need to start acting like a global power and taking on the responsibilities of a global power and contribute to global governance proportionate to their capabilities. And Zellick was actually quite critical of China's having been a free rider, essentially, on the international system. That was in the second Bush term when he was Deputy Secretary of State. And Obama, when he came to office, really inherited that and bought into that. If there was a shift from Bush to Obama, it was Obama's embrace, even greater embrace of the global governance dimension of the relationship than the Bush administration. Of course, the Bush administration was viewing everything, if you recall, through the anti-counterterrorism, not post 9/11 prism. So Obama came into office, with his liberal leanings and beliefs in international institutions and global issues, and he very much bought into the Zellick paradigm. And so he went to Beijing on his first trip in November 2009. I was actually living there on a sabbatical at the time, so I witnessed it. He was rebuffed by the Chinese government, stiffly, behind closed doors and publicly. That visit did not go well. The Chinese did not treat him well. And he went there with an agenda of a hand outstretched saying, please be a partner with the United States on helping tackle all these global governance challenges that confront humanity. The Chinese, for whatever their reasons, but I think their reasons had to do with the fact that they viewed this American attempt to get them involved in global governance as a trap to kind of hold them down and bleed them, actually. The Chinese assumption is the U.S. just wants to hold China down. And that we've tried different methods over the decades in doing that. And this latest method was to get China actually involved in areas around the world and activities in which China didn't have any individual national interest. And it would kind of bleed China. So that was, they were very suspicious, very reticent, and opposed. So they sent President Obama home with a scolding. And that was really instrumental. Because his policy and his perspectives on China shifted. And for the following 7 years, he has pursued the strategic hedging policy. Yet with, I would say, pragmatic attempts to continue to engage China on global governance issues, because he really does believe that, if you're going to address these global challenges, many countries need to participate and contribute multilaterally. But the two big powers really have to. So Obama's never really given up on that, even though he was rebuffed initially. You might have read the interview he did with Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic magazine a couple months ago, in which he, amongst other things, observed that he wished he had the luxury of the Chinese president to opt out of global responsibilities. He said, I wish I could be Xi Jinping and kind of pick and choose what I want to get involved in and opt out, So Obama's been rather critical but persistent, I would argue, in trying to get the Chinese to step up in this area. I'll come back to that in a second. The strategic hedging part of the Obama so-called pivot policy included the strengthening of U.S. alliances around the region, of which we have 5, as you probably know, plus enhancing non-allied strategic relationships, particularly with Singapore, Vietnam, and India, building up and enhancing the American military presence in the region. 60% of our naval assets will now be deployed in the Pacific, and a number of other Army and Air Force assets. And supporting economic and strategic partnerships with other countries in the region. So, as you know, Obama has prioritized Asia. This is the first president of the United States who has ever said Asia first, not Europe, not transatlantic relations, Asia first. And he's done what he could do with the pivot policy. It has not been well resourced. He's been opposed by the Congress, and but nonetheless, I think deserves a lot of credit for reorienting American foreign policy and strategic priorities to that region. So that's one important thing that Trump will inherit. Now, on global governance, after 6 or 7 years, I think we have to also recognize that China has finally upped its game, you might say, and has now contributed much more to this sphere since 2013 and under Xi Jinping. I will give Xi Jinping personal credit for it. We now see China doing what it wasn't doing previously. The climate change agreement, the Paris Climate Change Accord, would not have happened without the Chinese participation and work with Obama on this. The Iran nuclear deal probably would not have occurred without the Chinese. They worked, constructively behind the scenes. UN peacekeeping operations, anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, public health coordination over the Zika virus, the Ebola virus prior to that, and other areas. China has now really, as I say, increased its contributions both in terms of financial resources but also personnel in these areas. That's good news. That's what Robert Zoellick called for in 2005. Okay, so better late than never, as they say. Now the question is whether the Americans under the new administration are going to withdraw from this sphere. Interestingly, just 2 days ago, the new Secretary General-elect of the United Nations, Guterres, was in Beijing, met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Wang Yi, very pointedly, I was saying this to Mary's class yesterday, said, we, the Chinese, are now upholders of the global governance system. We're not going to stop upholding the system, trying to reassure both the UN Secretary General and the world that, in fact, China, if Trump and the Americans kind of withdraw from this area of foreign policy, the Chinese are ready to be there. That's good news. We welcome that. Absolutely welcome it. Okay. So in other areas, however, it must be said that the recent state of U.S.-China relations and the relationship the Trump administration is going to inherit can be characterized by increasing frictions and across-the-board and rising competition. The relationship is not in good condition, I would argue. Competition is pervasive across the military strategic domain, competition for influence in Asia, growing international competition given China's rapidly expanding commercial and political presence all over the world, ideological competition, at least insofar as the Chinese are concerned, because they see the United States as part of a concerted campaign to undermine the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, and they are thus in a kind of Cold War mindset about the United States ideologically. I wouldn't say the U.S. is necessarily in an ideological Cold War with them. And finally, increased constrictions on American and other foreign businesses in China. So you name the area, and you will likely find a competitive, fraught dynamic in that area between the United States and China. Includes cyber hacking, by the way, and other forms of espionage. So there are considerable tensions in this relationship. Add to this mutual perceptions, public perceptions. So the Pew Global Attitudes Project, which is one of several that survey American publics and other publics, Chinese publics, have some very interesting statistics. In one of their recent polls, they found that 68% of the American public and 80% of experts describe China as a competitor of the United States. Only 26% of Americans said China could be, quote, trusted. Then they interviewed in China, same set of questions. And the Chinese respondents, 66% of the Chinese respondents described the United States as a competitor, almost identical numbers. While 15% said the United States was China's enemy, DREN. So, you have roughly 2/3 of the publics in both countries viewing the other in the same negative, suspicious, even hostile way. Mutual distrust, therefore, is very high at the public level. So while regrettable, this negativity, I think, however, is to be expected. We should, at least we China specialists or social scientists should not be surprised by this. And moreover, I think it's the new normal. We have to get used to it. This is the natural paradigm, not some sort of false, cooperative, harmonious paradigm. That's not reality. And no matter how you view the relationship, if you're a political scientist, you know, there are these paradigms called the power transition paradigm of rising powers and established powers, or what they call the security dilemma in international relations, or whether you look at the ideological dimension, the two political systems, or other perspectives, it is not abnormal that these two major powers are not getting along very well. It would in fact be quite abnormal if they were. So I don't think we should be surprised. We should accept it. And then the question becomes, if that's the new normal, how do you manage it? How do you keep this fraught relationship from becoming worse, from bleeding into a full adversarial relationship? Because it does have that potential. And if it's not effectively managed by both sides, and in fact the relationship, I'm going to argue in a minute, is not in the control of both sides, both governments, that is to say. There are a lot of exogenous factors internally in each country and externally that shape it. But it needs to be managed lest we have a conflict. I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. So, except recognizing that the relationship is fraught, has a lot of frictions, that's the first point. Yet we should recall at the same time the more positive, cooperative dimensions of the relationship. This is what sets the U.S.-China relationship apart from the U.S.-Soviet Cold War relationship. There are a number of positive dimensions and interdependencies in the U.S.-China relationship. Let me give you a few statistics to illustrate that. Beginning with trade, $660 billion in two-way trade last year. 16% of American total trade is with China. And China is the fastest growing export market for American goods. Tell that to Mr. Trump. I don't think he knows that. Now he may, that's not production. American companies going to China to produce to re-export to the United States. That's American products being made here, being exported there, right? U.S.-China Business Council has lots of good statistics on that. Then investment. What about investment? Well, the United States has a cumulative $75 billion in investment in China, and it employs, according to recent estimates, 1.6 million Chinese workers. American firms in China employ 1.6 million Chinese workers. Chinese investment coming this direction, that's a newer story and a very important story. Last year, let's say 2015, Chinese firms invested $20 billion in the United States, employing 100,000 Americans. So think about that. Americans working in Chinese auto parts factories and other various types of firms here. But this year's statistics, even more stunning. In the first 9 months of 2016, this year, China has already invested $121 billion, tenfold increase over last year, this year, in the United States. It's just skyrocketing. And as you probably know from reading the news, it's attracting the attention of the Congress and the executive branch and an organization in the U.S. government called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. So this investment's now being scrutinized more carefully for national security implications. But it's a big dimension. Students. 400,000 Chinese students in American university and secondary school campuses this year. Actually, probably more than 400,000. There are about 100,000 Chinese students in American high schools and in secondary schools, 300,000 plus in American universities. Tourists, 1.8 million Chinese tourists came to the United States last year, and they spent a whopping $21.1 billion here in this country. That's a revenue stream, okay? So it's also an indication of interdependence. Then we have sister city and sister state relationships, including Michigan's own very robust, long-standing relationships in China. Governor Snyder's done a great deal to increase that, but it goes back, in fact, to the years I was a student here when Michigan paired with Liaoning, if I remember correctly, as the sister state province relationship. Anyway, there are many indicators of interdependence. I think when we're looking at the stressed nature of U.S.-China relations, we have to also bear in mind this more cooperative dimension. And the cooperative dimension does serve to some extent to buffer the more competitive dimension. But both sides have to constantly work on expanding that cooperative domain and containing, if you will, the competitive domain. Okay, so that's generally speaking what President Trump and his new administration is going to inherit. So what are their dispositions, or what can we say in these very, very, very early days by way of speculation? And I have to underlie speculation because that's all we have about his administration's perspectives on China and what kind of China policy we might get from them. So during the campaign, as you recall, candidate Trump threatened to slap 45% across-the-board tariffs on Chinese goods, and to label China a currency manipulator on day one, unquote, which would trigger retaliation from the Chinese on both of those actions and likely trade war. Secondly, he said, interestingly, next to nothing about China strategically, militarily, or China's internal situation at all throughout the entire campaign. Nothing about human rights, nothing about repression, nothing about the Chinese military, nothing about the dynamics of Asia or other elements. He's focused entirely on the economic dimension of the U.S.-China relationship from what we've said so far. He did call for a substantial overhaul and rebuilding of U.S. military forces, right, across the board, adding 100 ships to the American Navy. And one would have to assume that if this occurred, that much of that would go to the Asia-Pacific region and the existing pivot policy that I just discussed, as well with China in mind, China and North Korea, I should say, in mind. We're not just deploying forces to the Asia-Pacific region for no reason. We're deploying them there because of China. And we should be much more explicit, I think, and open about that. And North Korea, which is really the number one threatening issue on the top of his desk when he walks into the Oval Office. So Trump also, as we know, called for increased burden sharing, or at least that's the term that's normally associated with it, financial contributions to U.S. alliances abroad, arguing the U.S. Pays the price, shoulders all the burden. Somebody needs to educate him there too. Japan, for example, pays 45%, I believe, of the costs of the American bases and forces in Japan. I don't know about South Korea or Australia. If he can get better, buy-in and contributions from those countries, as well as Thailand and the Philippines, that's a whole other questionable issue. Good. But I would highly doubt that a Trump administration is going to walk away from these alliances. There would be an enormous outcry in the region and in this country and in the Congress should he try to do so. So his kind of isolationist rhetoric would meet resistance if indeed he wished to kind of pull back from Asia and from NATO. So while candidate Trump did not have anything really to say about China's rise in the world or about U.S.-China relations broadly speaking, or China's broader context of U.S.-China relations in Asia, we have very few, clues or straws to try and understand what his thinking is. Therefore, what one normally does is look to the advisors. Who are the advisors? And what do they think? And what is their track record? What have they had to say about China? Well, this is still early days, and it's very speculative. We don't even have a Secretary of State or Defense yet. But we do know that there have been several people appointed, particularly General Flynn as National Security Advisor, his Deputy National Security Advisor, M.T. McFarlane, who I just learned yesterday was an undergraduate student at George Washington University in the Institute of Sino-Soviet Studies and studied Chinese there before I actually got there as an undergraduate. So, that's a long time ago, but that institute, by the way, was a very Cold War kind of institution. So if that had any residual effect on her thinking about China today, it would be through that prism. So they've been appointed. There are other names being floated around: John Bolton, Peter Navarro, an economist at the University of California, Irvine, who is the author of a book called Death by China, with a parallel documentary movie you can see online on YouTube if you're interested. Michael Pillsbury is a consultant to the transition team. His most recent book, The 100-Year Marathon, you've probably heard of. Stephen Yates, who was Vice President Cheney's China assistant in the Bush administration. These are all real hardliners, very hostile to China, with long track records of hostility to China. They see China as a peer competitor or a threat to the United States. So we'll see, what positions they get, what policies they take once in the positions. They may be balanced with a group of so-called realist moderates. Now, if Romney becomes Secretary of State, actually I started thinking about it. Is he a realist moderate when it comes to China? Well, if you go back 4 years and you look at what he said during the campaign 4 years ago, he's no realist moderate. His rhetoric is very similar to what I just described on China. So I guess my intuition is that this new administration is moving in a very hawkish direction on China and foreign affairs, broadly speaking. That's one set of interpretations. So we'll have to wait and see. It's all speculative. Let's turn to the Chinese side of the equation briefly. So next autumn, as I say, they're going to have their own 19th Party Congress. And what is the situation going into that Congress? Congress is going to be important in terms of personnel changes. 60% of the Central Committee is going to turn over. 15 of 25 members of the Political Bureau will turn over. 5 of 7 members of the Political Bureau Standing Committee will turn over, by which I mean retire because of age, if actually they adhere to their own age requirements. That's one of the issues of speculation. But if they do, there are going to be a lot of new faces and substantial turnover next year. So there's a lot of sort of peakingology that's going on amongst people in our field now, trying to identify the factions and Xi Jinping's group and other groups, and who might ascend the throne, as you might say, next year. And in this, I think, contemplation of what might happen next year, there are two alternative interpretations amongst China watchers that at least I associate with. The first is that Xi Jinping is totally in control, and after the first 5 years of cleaning house, you might say, he will embark upon a robust reformist road after the Congress in his second 5-year term. And then there's speculation, too, that he may not even step down after his 2 5-year terms. We don't know. We'll have to wait for that. But that's the first school of thought. President in control. He's been doing all these things with his anti-corruption campaign and so on. But we'll see a different Xi Jinping after next year. That's the first school of thought. Second school of thought, he's not totally in control. He's experiencing substantial resistance and is not really a reformer in the first place. So evidence of the first school of thought includes the total concentration of power that he has garnered in his own personal hands, thus breaking the 30-year consensual collective decision-making leadership norm that Deng Xiaoping started after the Maoist period. The cult of personality that he has created around himself and has been created around him by the propaganda department of the party. The success of his vigorous anti-corruption campaign and other propaganda campaigns such as the China Dream campaign and the Four Comprehensives campaign. These are his signature campaigns. Those are indicators, and plus continued economic growth above 6%, 6.7% for the last 3 quarters. Okay, so the first school of thought is that he's in control and China's on the right path, and they've had to kind of clean things up, and then we're going to get a real reformist thrust after next fall. Second school of thought, the alternative viewpoint, the one I subscribe to, namely that Xi is not as strong as he seems on the surface. He's an isolated leader, what I call a patron with no clients in a patron-client system, or a handful of clients, but literally you can count them on one hand. He's a very isolated leader at the top, very imperial, kind of emperor-like figure. He's overreached in garnering power in his own hands. He's broken this 30-year collective decision-making norm. He faces substantial bureaucratic and vested interest resistance to his economic reforms, which have really not gone very far at all in the 3 years since they were announced. He's made a huge number of enemies in the party bureaucracy, the state bureaucracy, the military bureaucracy, and the corporate bureaucracies through his anti-corruption campaign, which was necessary. So I'll grant him that. Corruption was so pervasive and was really undermining the regime. So he gets it. You know, he knows the Kuomintang, Ernie will tell you this, amongst other reasons, the Kuomintang went down because of corruption. The Qing went down because of corruption. You know, so Chinese regimes go down for different reasons, but corruption seems to be one of the common features. So Xi Jinping got that and has really been prosecuting an extraordinary campaign there. 449,000 individuals have been brought to account and, quote, disciplined, unquote, in this campaign over the last 3 years. But the campaign's had a lot of collateral side effects, including the creation, really, of a culture of fear in the system, not just the society, in the system amongst the elites. So he's going after the elites, right? He's very popular with the masses because it's just like the United States, Chinese, populism with Chinese characteristics. They're all angry at elites in China, just as Americans are angry at elites, we gather. So the corruption campaign is very popular as that result, but it's not popular with the elites because they're on the receiving end of this, and there's an arbitrariness to the campaign in any event. So it's appearing to be as much of a political purge as it is a widespread campaign. It's not being implemented equally, you might say. Okay, so, and a couple of other elements of the alternative viewpoint is that Xi Jinping is sitting atop a ruling party that is considerably disconnected from the society that it pretends to rule. And then there are a variety, if that's not enough, a variety of troubling economic indicators. Declining growth rates, excess capacity, ballooning inventories. Another housing bubble. It's the third one in 6 years. No state-owned enterprise reform. Very threatening debt levels, 282% of GDP, which any economist will tell you this is red light flashing territory. No significant financial sector reform, continued opacity and lack of transparency and minimal rule of law. No takeoff for the free trade zones. Significant capital outflight, by which I don't mean foreign investment. I'm talking about personal assets of Chinese being moved abroad. $982 billion last year, according to Standard Chartered Bank. So the elite of China, who have profited from the reforms of the last 30 years quite well. China has more millionaires and billionaires than the United States. What are they doing? They're voting with their wallets and they're voting with their feet. They're moving their personal assets, their family members out of the country. That's called hedging behavior, right? They're not, and that speaks volumes to me. That is maybe the most significant, factoid about China today, is the elite of the country are leaving. And they're going to move the other foot out of the country if the system gets more shaky. So these are and then they've constricted the business environment for foreign companies in China. So these are the elements of the second school of thought, which includes, I would add to that, the very repressive internal political environment, some of which I've mentioned already, the culture of fear, civil society, law, crackdown on civil society, crackdown on public sphere, crackdown on the intelligentsia, controlled media, internet, social media, stifled educational system, ban on foreign textbooks in Chinese universities, repressed minorities, alienated middle and upper classes who are moving abroad. So that's at least my reading of China today. Very unstable. This is not a stable country. Or at least there's ephemeral, superficial stability. So I suppose if you're in China looking at the United States, you could make a very similar kind of argument. Interesting, the parallel perspectives. Okay, so with these two unsettled internal situations, this has obviously got to affect U.S.-China relations. U.S.-China relations don't operate in some sort of hermetically sealed sphere. They are responsive to domestic and, as I say, international pressures. And generally speaking, the U.S., I think it's fair to say, is overstretched internationally. This is where Trump is right. You know, we're overstretched and under-resourced. While China, I would say, is stretching and over-resourced. They've got a lot of money to spend. So those are kind of macro trends, and that's where the power transition theorists come in. And they will tell you that the most dangerous point in the so-called Thucydides trap, I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, is from the Peloponnesian Wars, is when the rising power approaches the status and attributes of the established power is the most conflict-prone time, most dangerous time for war. Well, that's what we're getting to in some measures, economic measures at least, although I continue to think that if you look at a range of indicators, as I did in my book, China Goes Global, I come to the conclusion the United States is still in a much, much stronger global position than China is. China has minimal soft power, no real global military power, no global diplomatic influence. I mean, what major global crisis have the Chinese resolved lately? None, So they're kind of single-dimensional power, economic power. As the Soviet Union was a single-dimensional power, military power. So that's why I subtitled this book, China Goes Global, The Partial Power. They're not in the league of the United States yet, even given all the problems the United States has. So what does this say about U.S.-China relations? Almost in conclusion, last section. So there are a host of issues. One way to kind of get at that question, where do we go from here, is sort of what people do in Washington all the time. They just go down the list of issues on the agenda. The commercial relationship, cybersecurity, human rights, North Korea, South China Sea, Asia-Pacific security, Hong Kong, which is now another issue, and so on and so forth. That's important, that menu of issues. Each of them are very complex in their own right. Each of them have huge bureaucratic actors and vested interests and resources in both governments. But that's really not, I think, the best way to look at the state of the relationship today. There are deeper forces at work in this relationship. Let me just conclude by giving you four sort of variables, I guess, macro variables that I think are going to shape the way this relationship goes, or already, but over the next few years. The first I would identify is the Chinese Communist Party's political insecurity, which, manifests itself in the repression we've been seeing, the significantly increased repression inside of China in the last really 7 years. It goes back to 2009. It has intensified under Xi Jinping. But I would suggest to you that repression is not a sign of confidence and security of a regime, just the opposite. It's a sign of insecurity. They're afraid. And what they're afraid of, and is that a valid perspective, is another question. I mean, I don't think they need to feel as afraid as they seem to be acting. And my Chinese colleagues that I talked to, same story. But anyway, they're acting in a very insecure manner, part of which involves their views of the United States, which, as I say, they view as having a subversive mission or commitment to subverting Chinese communist rule. It goes by the phrase foreign hostile forces. Okay, so there's a campaign ongoing in China. Used to be called bourgeois liberalization, now it's called foreign hostile forces, against the United States as undermining stability, right? Stability is code word for regime sustenance in China, in my view. So the first variable is really the kind of identity, the kind of insecurity the Chinese bring to the table, to the relationship with the United States. So sitting across the table from President Trump is actually an insecure leader in Xi Jinping, not a secure, confident leader, but he's at least got an insecure regime. He may be a confident leader, which he is, but the regime itself is not confident. Now, if the Trump administration initiates a period when the U.S. draws inward and focuses more on, I hate to use the word nation building, or rebuilding, making America great again, at home, this could actually relieve the perception that China has, or the Chinese Communist Party has, I don't think the Chinese population have this, is very much a party view, of American subversion. So if the U.S. pulls back, that's going to give the CCP some breathing space, theoretically. Now, as I say, Trump has never said anything about China's internal situation. It's just like not even in his consciousness. He's a businessman. And business people, I should say, who do business overseas tend to view human rights policy as a needless impediment to doing business, right? They don't like the administration talking about human rights because it impedes their commercial activities. So I suspect that's the way Trump looks at the internal situation in China. It's just a non-factor to him. So that would suggest that, not that the Obama administration has been in the face of the Chinese on this. I would fault the Obama administration for having been far too relaxed and silent, and the president himself on the human rights situation in China, which is the worst it has been since 1989. What do you hear from Washington about that? Nothing. So that's one criticism of Obama I will lay at his doorstep. But you're not going to hear anything out of a Trump administration about China's internal situation. Therefore, that element of tension in the relationship may actually subside, although the economic and strategic tensions will continue. Second variable, Chinese nationalism and national identity and sense of returning to its role as a major power on the global stage. This is not going to change. The likelihood is only going to increase. Chinese believe their time has come, and the Americans' time has also come. And America's in terminal decline, and they're in extended ascent. Therefore, why is this a variable? Because it could lead to China overreaching and overreacting to events, be they accidents, inadvertent military incidents like the EP3 crisis, whether it's over Taiwan, which could very well come back onto the agenda in the next few years, whether it's over the East or South China Sea disputes, or over North Korea. In other words, the Chinese sense of confidence, perhaps overconfidence, could cause them to take actions or to test the United States in ways that that would trigger an American response. So that's a kind of dynamic that I worry about. Third variable, somewhat parallel to the second, depends on how the United States defines its national interest and strategic position in East Asia and the Asia-Pacific region. If the U.S. takes or continues to take a rather maximalist position, one that allows for no peer competitor in the region, and denies China strategic space, then that's going to cause problems and frictions, increasing frictions and problems. This is China's front yard, the Western Pacific. It's the way the Americans think of the Caribbean and Central America, perhaps. We have the luxury of having two oceans, right, to buffer us. China has 200 years of encroachment on its maritime frontier from foreign powers, the most significant of which last half century is the United States. So this is a huge variable. Whether the United States remains forward deployed, how the United States defines its own strategic interests in Asia, whether it pulls back, what kind of decisions the Trump administration makes on that. The analogy would be similar to to Great Britain at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. When the US was the rising power, Britain was the established power, and the British basically decided to cede the Western Hemisphere to the United States. Said, okay, we've got greater interests in the Middle East, North Africa, the Far East. Latin America is not a high priority for us in Whitehall. Over to you, US. That diffused the Thucydides trap at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. So if Trump decides to pursue his insular come home America instincts, it would be similar to that and would cede the Western Pacific and cede East Asia to China as its own sphere of influence. I hope he doesn't do that. I don't actually expect him to do that, but it is a variable. And lastly, the fourth variable is that this is not a binary bilateral relationship between the US and China. There are many other countries and actors in the region, and they have a say. Some of them are allied with the United States, 5, South Korea, Japan, Thailand, Australia, and for the time being, the Philippines. Some are what I'd call strategically aligned, but not formal allies, namely Vietnam and Singapore. Several are strategically neutral, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Mongolia, Laos, and only one country in the region, Cambodia, is aligned strategically with China. So, but none of these countries, no matter what category you put them in, none of them want to be forced to choose between Washington and Beijing. That's their nightmare. They want to continue to have very deep, broad economic relations with both, not just China. The United States' economic position in Asia is often unappreciated. It's very, very significant. So they want good economic relations with the US and China, but they want strategic security and defense from the United States. Not a single country in Asia that I'm aware of is looking to Beijing for their security. So the last thing countries in Asia want is for Trump or the Americans to decide to go home. That would leave them exposed to China, which they fear wishes to kind of institute a 21st century version of the tribute system anyway. And they've all, for different historical reasons, had their own difficulties with China. They see the United States as their main guarantor, right? So they want to keep the U.S. in place. So that they play a role. That's a fourth variable. So when I think about the next few years and the possible pathways for the U.S.-China relationship that it could take, these four variables, contextual variables, come to mind. So this is a transitional time. The relationship is characterized by rising competition, I would say predominant competition, secondary cooperation, but it's not about to go off the cliff. Since 1972, and through 9 American presidents and 8 Chinese leaders, this is not the first time we've had frictions, right? We have had them in the past. And the relationship has continued to endure and grow to both societies' benefit. It's extremely deep. That's why I gave you all those statistics about interdependence. We have to keep those in mind. That's what distinguishes this relationship from the Cold War and the US-Soviet dynamic. But it's very fragile and it's very unpredictable. Finally, historians, and I'm just reading this new book by John Pomfret, which has just appeared and been reviewed in a lot of newspapers in the last few days, called The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom. Well, Pomfret, like other historians previously, reminds us that there has been a repetitive cycle in US-China relations going back more than 200 years, what is sometimes called the love-hate cycle, that Americans and Chinese have these polarizing perceptions of each other. And I wrote my PhD dissertation here at Michigan on Chinese perceptions of the United States. And I entitled it Beautiful Imperialist. is how they perceive us. But I also argued, as have others, that this has been a repetitive cycle. So we're now, and the cycle goes like this. It's a repetitive pattern. There are 6 phases, and I'll finish on this point. So the first phase is kind of naive admiration and enchantment, where the two newlyweds just get married and they're on their honeymoon. And then after the honeymoon, second phase begins, reality intrudes, respective interests assert themselves, differences of opinion and frictions arise, and things become more difficult. The rose wears off, which leads to the third phase of the relationship. Arguments ensue, which leads to a fourth phase, attempts, sometimes mediated through third parties, therapy or whatever, to ameliorate the arguments and find some pragmatic common ground. Unfortunately, in international relations, there are no marriage counselors. Then there's a fifth phase, the failure to find common ground, which leads to estrangement and possibly conflict. That's a phase, if you study the works of Warren Cohen, for example, and many other historians, Harold Isaacs, Michael Oxenberg even, Alan Whiting, everybody recognizes this pattern. So we are now in the estrangement phase of the U.S.-China relationship, again, for I think the 7th time. If you look at these cycles going back 200 years, we've been through 7 or 8 maybe now of these patterns, of this pattern. So the one difference this time compared to all the previous times is that in the previous times, China was weak and the United States was a much stronger power. Today, it's much more equal. And so therefore, China will act in different ways. They won't try and ameliorate the relationship. Their pragmatism, this compromises Chinese pragmatism, I think. China is much more assertive now because of its confidence, and they're going to stand up to the U.S. and they say, we're not going to take it anymore. So that makes me worry, actually. At the end of the day, this is not the best marriage in the world, but it's a marriage where divorce is not an option, because divorce means war. On that happy note, I will end. Thank you. And we have till 5:30, Mary? 5:30. Okay, so I'm sorry, I haven't given this before, and I ran longer than I anticipated. But we got 20 minutes. I'll be happy.
For recording, we just ask that you wait to get the mic before you speak.
I'll start in the back, young man.
Hi, my name is Vincent. I'm more of a econ major. But so I have this question. Do you think that China hasn't been this aggressive in military stand since 1980?
No. Not since 1980. In 1979, China attacked Vietnam.
Yeah, that's like the time period I'm saying.
But since 1980, no.
Yeah, so so the second question I'm more focused on is, do you see a potential war there then for President Xi to extend his 10 years presidency through a war like with some countries down there?
Well, China's military capabilities have increased substantially in the last 20 years. China's military budget, second highest in the world. Its Navy, second largest in the world. Ballistic missiles, cyber capabilities, Air Force getting much better. Submarines. So overall, Chinese military capacity has transformed. So if Mr. Xi decides that he wants to become more aggressive or assertive or whatever, he now has the instruments to do so. His predecessors didn't have that instrument. So then the question is, would he do so? In what cases? Taiwan, South China Sea, Japan, over the East China Sea, India, or an accident? As I say, what I worry about is another U.S.-China military accident, or a China-Japan military accident, because China and Japan do not have the protocols in place that the U.S. and China now have, fortunately, as of last year. should an accident take place. So accidents can trigger spirals, right, in action-reaction behavior. So, I don't see China as intrinsically aggressive or necessarily assertive, but the definition of their national sovereignty and so-called core interests, this is new. And they will use force to assert those core interests if necessary. So, I'm not predicting they're going to. I'm just saying they're in a different position now than they ever have been. Next, yes, down here.
Hi, my name is Jeff Kraczynski. What is a lesson that you think young people of our generation in the United States should take from your studies?
My studies?
From your research, your experience?
Of 40 years? I can't answer that question.
Meaning, what would you hope that we take into the future?
Don't be naive about China. Wish for the best, but don't anticipate it. I have to think a lot of my generation are very disillusioned with China today. It's not the China we hoped for, we studied, we thought we knew. So we should be faulted for naivete to some extent. So people of your generation need to have your eyes wide open about the nature of this country we're dealing with, we Americans. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Shambaugh. My name is Ilang from Political Science Department.
Oh, right.
So my question is, the thing about Trump being much ignorant about the situations in China and also his unpredictable nature, because one thing in international relations theory or bargaining theory in general is that the relationship can be confrontational, but it doesn't necessarily need to physical conflicts, as long as you have transparency and consistency in your intentions where you draw the red lines.
Right.
So right now, is there a way for the United States to establish that, to communicate its red lines, its transparencies, its consistencies, so that even if the relationship is confrontational, but then it discourages opportunism. Once you have opportunism, you have higher probability of conflicts. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent question, which is why I identified, I think, the third variable about how the United States, or second variable, how it defines its position in Asia. Because the Chinese are constantly probing American alliances in Asia. They want the United States out of Asia. That's another conclusion I've come to. They're not comfortable with the U.S. in Asia at all. And you can't really blame them to a certain extent. So if that's the operative assumption, and they're constantly probing the Australian alliance or the Thai alliance and now the Filipino alliance or the South Korean alliance, then the question is how do the Americans respond? Obama's been really good in this. He's strengthened these alliances. He's been very transparent, very clear about different issues from the Senkaku Diaoyu issue. But the Trump administration may send less clear signals, as they have done during the campaign. This is not good, what he's been saying during the campaign. Doesn't reassure allies, and it just gives the Chinese, open opportunity to continue their probing activities in their neighborhood, which we have to recognize at the end of the day is their neighborhood. But the United States has been a Pacific power since 1900, and we have been the dominant Pacific power since 1945. So we're not just going to pack up and go home, nor should we. But the question is, how do we define our presence out there? That's why I use the word strategic space. We've got to figure out some way. And here Xi Jinping, for his part, has actually said the Pacific, one of his speeches, the Pacific is big enough for both of us. Well, that's great, Mr. Xi. Let's see if you really agree to that. But we have to say the same thing to the American side. Can the Americans give, instead of this maximalist position, give China strategic space in its front yard, after all, right? So do we continue to fly reconnaissance missions up and down the China coast, 7 days a week inside their 200-mile economic zone, that's what I'd call a maximalist position. It doesn't enhance Chinese confidence in the American position. So both sides have got to kind of reassess this, but the U.S. has got to be clear. If the U.S. isn't clear, the Chinese are very good at eating away at the American position. Yeah, back here.
Hi, my name is Mario Rebus, and I'm a junior studying public policy here at Ford.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if Trump were to impose this potential tariff that he was speaking of during his campaign, I'm wondering what do you think would be the policy response from China? And with that, I'm wondering, do you think that American demand for Chinese goods and services is elastic if the Chinese were to respond with some sort of tariff of their own? Or
I suspect they would respond with reciprocal tariffs, not necessarily symmetrical tariffs, though, not 45 for 45. In fact, I just read a study about this yesterday from the Peterson Institute that argues they may come back with 15% counter tariffs or 20% counter tariffs. But what we can anticipate, and the Chinese media has already been quite explicit about, is increased pressure on on purchases from American companies, Boeing, grain, and soybeans in particular from the Midwest, other technology imports that they buy from the U.S. they would give to Europeans or other powers, and more pressure on American companies operating in China, which is already pretty extreme. It's gotten a lot worse. So yeah, they're not going to just sit on their hands and say, oh, yes, Mr. Trump, 45. It'll trigger a pretty nasty trade war very easily. I hate to keep you running around. Let's come over here. We'll come back.
I have a question about something that you noted that I think is really striking in the Trump administration, at least so far, that he has this isolationist rhetoric and did in the campaign, but then some of the things like the Navy buildup and the people that he's put in office, appointed so far, don't seem that would not be their strategy, that they would have a much more interventionist strategy, particularly in Asia Pacific. So in regards to this contradiction, do you think it's because it's an accident because there's a sort of vacuum in foreign policy expertise in the Trump administration simply because many people said they would never work for him? Or do you think it's somehow intentional on his part?
It's a great question, Mary, but hard to answer because it's so early. But you've just put your finger on the first response, which is the number of Republican foreign policy, national security experts who have taken themselves out of the running by signing those petitions and saying we will never work for, much less vote for, Mr. Trump. And so far I haven't seen, except for Romney, he's a different category, but none of them have decided to say, okay, election's over, we'll go to work for you. And the Trump campaign, we do know, is penalizing people who are not loyal, right? So there's a vacuum, definite vacuum of civilian foreign policy expertise. Perhaps, I'm just guessing off the top of my head, maybe that helps explain the preponderance of military people we see taking these positions. We've never had one time before had a national security advisor as a general under Bush, and he lasted about 6 months. Frankly, I think Flynn will be lucky if he lasts 6 months. He's a very divisive character with not a very good track record. He got fired from DIA a few years ago. I know people who worked for him, so the man's just a disaster. But he has no experience with Asia. He's totally focused on the Middle East. McFarlane, we don't know much about her. There's a vacuum of expertise, but it's still early. They haven't even gotten all the cabinet level positions in. We don't know who the deputy assistant secretary, the assistant secretary is going to be, or so on and so forth. There are career foreign service officers, thank God, who staff the government. And we just have to hope that they have a steady hand throughout this transition period. But it's of concern. There's a kind of military heavy emphasis so far on the foreign national security policy and apparatus. Last thing I'd say is if you look at the Republican platform from the convention, which is usually not a great indicator of what an administration is going to do once they come into power, there they say quite a lot about China, and they're very critical of China military, China's security expansion, South China Sea, very robust on Taiwan, very critical on China's internal human rights, just what you would expect from a Republican platform. So maybe, those sorts of elements, which, as I say, I think that we're going to see a much more confrontational position towards China. It's my own guess, but it's a guess. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Amy C2. I teach Chinese culture and history at Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the university. Oh. I have two observations. One is if Donald Trump is a businessman, defense industry is also business. Yeah. So wars could be triggered because somebody wants to make some money. Mm-hmm. Okay. The second, so this has been recognized. The second thing is, do you agree that China is very busy building diplomatic relations with many countries? I watch CCTV. Mm-hmm. Wow, Xi Jinping is very busy traveling all over the world, signing investment, infrastructure projects all over the world. Okay. And the latest one was to build a speed train from Beijing to Melbourne, opening in 2019 in 24 hours. I don't know how true it's going to be, but the trains are everywhere in Africa, South America, Iran. So don't you agree they're gradually building friends and diplomatic relations all over the world?
Absolutely. That's what my last book was about, China Goes Global. And since that was published, their commercial presence has increased exponentially. Yes, but there's a lot of it. If you look at it carefully and you kind of drill down, not as much of China's promises of investment are actually materialized. And if you're a global power, you better follow through on your promises. Take Indonesia. They promised the Chinese $40 odd billion of investment in Indonesia. $6 billion has materialized. And I'm told in other Southeast Asian countries there have been similar patterns. I'm going, as Mary just said, to live in Southeast Asia for the next 6 months, and that's one of the things I want to dig into. But I'm not criticizing it. I mean, China that's their, strong suit. I'm tempted to say trump card, but I won't. Their strong suit is money, and they're investing, and that's good. That's helping these recipient countries. Although it's self-interested, it's Chinese companies who are building the high-speed rail, not Bolivian companies. In fact, the one in Bolivia and Colombia collapsed. It didn't take place. But no, it's a major new dimension. The Asian Infrastructure Bank, good thing. The so-called One Belt, One Road initiative, $40 billion. That's not pocket change. Allocated just to the road part of that, the belt, I think, is $30 billion. So this is enormous amounts of money. The United States, it just dwarfs the Marshall Plan. We don't have this country, our government, and I talked to our officials. I know our Assistant Secretary of State recently went to the Philippines, and all he could do is promise $20 million in aid. The Chinese come in, and here's $20 billion. Seriously. So it's, that is international relations too. It's a big part of international relations. And countries, that buys, I don't know if it buys soft power, but it certainly buys some sort of allegiance, perhaps, and leverage by the Chinese government. The Chinese government will say, oh, well, we just built A, B, and C for you. This is what we want in the United Nations in return, or some other place. So, yeah, I think you've identified a good, important point. So while we're over here, and then I'll come back, last gentleman here.
I'm Bob Treadway, and I'm a master's degree from the university, and I also had Alan Whiting as an advisor. I really
Wonderful man.
liked him. So my question is about China cross-strait relations with Taiwan. I'm not worried about this. My son is in Taiwan now, and his Taiwanese wife, and they're going to fly to Shanghai in a week. Okay. And I just wondered about the flashpoints. I was there. I was in China when Chen Shui-bian was elected, and I know there was a great deal of silence, wondering what was going to happen to that. And I don't know if anything since then has had a similar kind of tension.
Not since Chen Shui-bian, no. We had 8 years of remarkable cross-strait stability and new forms of interaction, including airplane flights and postal services and cross-strait investment under Ma Ying-jeou. Ma Ying-jeou is no longer president. Tsai Ing-wen is president. Tsai Ing-wen has made reassuring statements, but she refuses to say the things Beijing wants her to say. So that's sort of one element, the government elite element. But the Taiwan corporate, well, there's three elements in Taiwan, the corporate and the public. So public opinion on Taiwan about the mainland is at all-time lows. It's, 70 plus 80% negative. There 8 years of interaction across the strait has produced disenchantment on the island, and certainly in the corporate community. And now the corporate community is invested on the mainland to such an extent that they feel beholden to the mainland, so they want to diversify and not pull out completely, but diversify from the mainland. And Tsai Ing-wen ran and was elected, landslide victory on this kind of critique. So, long story short, after 8 years of stabilization, we have a new dynamic, which is uncertain, and the Taiwanese are not at all enamored with the mainland. They never have been enamored. They kind of went through this 8-year flirtation period, you might say, the last 8 years, but now it's kind of like the US-China relationship. Honeymoon's over, and the rose has worn off the Taiwanese view of the mainland. Meanwhile, on the mainland side, because Tsai Ing-wen won't say what they want her to say, they're beginning to use their own economic leverage, beginning with tourism. So there were I think around 1.5 million Chinese mainland tourists going to Taiwan every year. That's been cut down to less than 100,000 since she was elected, I think is the figure. So that's revenue, first of all, for the island. So that's just the first lever the mainland's going to use. In other words, I see Xi Jinping becoming increasingly pressurizing Taiwan and increasingly impatient with Taiwan. And this gets back to the question about military. Now they have the military capacity, perhaps, to do something about Taiwan if they lose their, quote, patience, unquote. So I'm worried. This is going to be a new flashpoint in the US-China relationship as well. So we were kind of grown accustomed to 8 years of Taiwan not being front and center. I'm afraid it's going to come back. I don't want it to, but we have to be prepared for that, we the United States. Okay, I promise this gentleman way back here, maybe the last question. But I think your son's flight to the mainland next week is going to be okay.
Thank you. Technology is the question I'm asking if you can include as the one, if not the most important variables. And my comments, this is my question. Mm-hmm. My comments about this is so important technology. The Chinese government, if you can remember that the Hu Jintao and the past leaders, two leaders, including Xi Jinping, mm-hmm. They visit United States spend more times in Silicon Valley than Washington. They have more friends with Bill Gates rather than Warren Buffett and those people. Technology, China is getting so fast, surpassed the United States, the rail, the high-speed rail, the fintech, Just recently heard about that, the social credit score, but Chinese use that. So my point is, this factor, technology, probably is the most important, regardless of your war, competition or not, cyberspace, warfares, whatever. I don't know if Trump can repeat the same, what I consider as a mistake, as previous administration. Continue to leak this void, this gray area, rather than focus too much on military and finance, all of the things. That's interesting. What I heard you talk about variable, I agree. But I just don't hear a word you comment about this part. How much Chinese invest, how much ambition, and what is the role of two leaders in this field of technology?
Technology.
Whether competition, warfare, or cooperation. So that's my comments. But question is, what do you think?
Okay. Well, thanks for your question. I think that my response is it's a bit of both, like it is in other areas of the U.S.-China relationship. That's why I use the term coopetition. So there's some cooperation and some competition. So in the technology area, U.S. and Chinese firms are working together in China and in this country to co-develop different technologies. American firms are investing in Chinese companies. In fact, just last week, we can now invest directly onto the Shenzhen exchange. And there's a lot of, Shenzhen is the epicenter of indigenous innovation and technological development. So there's a lot of American capital going into Chinese companies, and there's a lot of Chinese capital, I gave you the figures, coming into this country, and increasingly going into the tech sector, as well as in Europe. So if you're looking at the Chinese outbound direct investment patterns over the last year, there's a direct correlation between the Made in China 2025 program and where their external investment is going. They are trying to acquire, through merger and acquisition, M&A activity, foreign firms in this country, in Canada, in Germany, in the UK, and elsewhere who have technological capacities that they do not have, but they want to get. So if they can steal it, and frankly, there's an enormous amount of corporate espionage, we know that, now they go out and buy it. And so this is going to be, in this country, it's already becoming an issue whether this committee I mentioned begins to scrutinize more carefully Chinese acquisitions of American firms. In Europe, they have no such committees. I've been speaking with the Germans a lot recently. They're really worried. The Chinese are going very targeted industries, the so-called Mittelstand in Bavaria and the Rhineland, buying up. These are strategic industries for the Germans. So this is a next, the next issue. It's kind of commercial. I don't know what to call it. Commercial national security. It's going to be tough to manage. So, good question. I wish I could give you a better answer. It's not something I do research on directly. But thanks everybody for coming today, and go Blue.